Hello and welcome everyone to Enigio's webinar number 2 in a series of webinar which we're launching in educational in industry adoption of trade digitalization purpose. My name is Patrik Zekkar. I'm the CEO of Enigio. And today I think we will have an extraordinary good agenda with some trade experts, which is joining us from various parts of the world. I will introduce them within short. A couple of words around the timing of this webinar, where we will seek some insightful discussion about data standards, interoperability, and digitization in the global trade industry. I think the timing is very well, but not consciously done. I think the topic is more important than ever right now, as we see move towards the MLETR, the Model Law for Electronic Transferable Record adoptions, broadening out in a faster pace. We see that the adoption and increase of complexity in transaction where electronic trade documents are used are moving upwards from 2 corners model to 3 corner model to even 5 corner model transactions where electronic trade documents are used and harness the benefits. We are in particular from Enigio side happy to have been launching the interoperability for the trade corridor in China together with our partner TradeGo, where we now have put up a digital highway where we can access the trade with China, which currently accounting to more than 5.9 trillion. So in the light of this, I think there will be some interesting topics to be discussed today. I would like to introduce the panel of experts in trade finance, data, sustainability, and technology solution. The stars are really aligned today when we have our distinguished guest, Pamela Mar from ICC, DSI, Managing Director. We have Sunay Mruthyunjay, Oracle Financial Services, Senior Director, Product Strategy. And we have Rebecca Harding, economist and also an expert in trade sustainability. Very, very welcome. And could I, before I let the speakers introduce themselves with a couple of words, have some house rules. We will encourage you to put questions in the chat. We will secure that you will get your question answered. If we will not have time during the session to reply on the question, and we will have a Q&A in the end, but you can shoot in questions meanwhile we're discussing. I will try to pick them up and incorporate them in the discussion. If we have not time to respond to everyone, we will follow up with the speakers separately and get the response and send them out to you afterwards. Now, I think the stars of the day, may I ask you to introduce yourself, Pamela? I think we have some audit problems here with Pamela. So let's start with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Harding. I'm a trade economist. I work independently with governments and banks to understand trade and supply chain finance. I do a lot of work with the ITFA on sustainability. I head up their working group, but I've also been the person who's put together some of the numbers for the economic case around MLETR adoption around the world with the ICC.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. I think you're a familiar face, been very visible in several discussions. Sunay.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Sunay Mruthyunjay. I am part of Oracle, and I lead the product strategy for banking products within the Oracle organization. And we have been doing some exciting work in the space of trade finance and supply chain finance. And this topic, as such, in terms of interoperability, standardization, kind of excites us from a technology provider standpoint because it eases a lot of things for us as well as our customers. So happy to be part of this webinar.
Thank you very much, Sunay, and we look forward to hear you. The topics we're going to address today is actually quite a lot. We try to narrow them down, but it was very difficult because in the context of trades, there are so many parameters and dimensions to take into consideration. So we're going to talk about structured data versus unstructured data. We're going to talk about data standards. We're going to address the challenges of digital interoperability. And we're going to talk, of course, about digitalizing trade documents. May I ask you to make a short introduction, Pamela?
Hi, everyone. I'm Pamela Mar. I'm leading the Digital Standards Initiative of the International Chamber of Commerce. And we aim to digitalize global trade by enabling interoperability, digital trust, and legal reform globally. And I'm based in Singapore. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. And you're currently calling in from Los Angeles.
No. I'm in Hong Kong. I'm in Hong Kong, where actually the government announced today a renewed focus on digital trade and digitalization as a part of the policy address. So it's a good day in Hong Kong.
Glad to hear. So let's jump into today's agenda then. And I will start with you, Rebecca, and let's start from the beginning. And we have talked about structured data, and there's a lot of dialogues around that. But could you elaborate on what is it actually, and why do you think it's important if you do?
So forgive me if I'm saying stuff that everyone already knows, but as an economist, I always break data up into stuff that can be organised and stuff that is intrinsically disorganised. And organised data is structured in a standardised format, so that makes it easier to use. It makes it easier to access, to store, retrieve and analyse. So as an economist, you always prefer the structured data because you think Excel spreadsheets, it's got predefined fields, it's got cells, and everything comes in a predefined format. So structured data is actually really much easier to create relationships between elements of the data. It's numbers or codifiable text. It's easy to process, and potentially it's a lot more secure as well. Disorganized data is completely the opposite, but equally as interesting, but much more difficult to put into logical frameworks. So in the context of digital trade, structured data gives us the essence of interoperability and standards. It's what we need to have. We need to define how we structure our data, how we're going to organise the data that we need to collect in order to make trade secure and sustainable, because anything outside of that framework or set of rules that is defined can act as a red flag. So structured data is really the essence of what we're trying to do with interoperability, I would say.
Thank you. The essence, Sunay, do you want to reflect on that from your perspective?
No, I think I'm kind of in agreement with Rebecca, right? I mean, standardization of data leads to a lot of, I would say, easier ways in which interoperability can come into the picture, particularly in a trade transaction where you have multiple parties who are involved with different levels of, I would say, digitalization. I think standardization, as well as when we talk of structured data, it solves a lot of problems. Now, of course, the one thing which we have to kind of keep in mind is that if it was easy, it would have been solved. The reasons why some of these standards have kind of not been adopted, at least across through the chain, I think we have to reflect on some of those problems and also leave those, I would say, wriggle room for ways in which each of the parties in the chain are able to leverage or add their own context to what is a standard and then make good use of it. I think that's where the key is to this whole thing of standardization and interoperability.
Thank you, Sunay. And Pamela, if I ask you, and I know that you've been very involved on this topic within the DCI. Do you agree with Sunay and Rebecca?
Yes, I actually don't think there's anyone who would disagree that standardizing data is a bad thing. Of course, we all do. It's just the question of how. And the question of how is pronounced because people started digitalizing in individual silos, and they didn't coordinate horizontally or vertically in the supply chain initially, that we were all using the same syntax and semantic data formats. So to go back and try to establish alignment and interoperability amongst a very heterogeneous data environment is actually the crux of the problem. I would say technology is providing us some solutions, but most of it is actually not scaled and not really proven in a real-time, highly, change in a changing environment. So what we're working on is to basically establish a data hierarchy where we say, let's all focus on standardizing the data elements which we need to share amongst each other and not worry about the other 80%, which doesn't need to be shared as critically. Let's start with the shareable data. And if we can establish that within a finite subset across many, many different parties, that will actually allow us to prove the benefits at scale to everybody. And then get more people to say, okay, I'll come on board and I may compromise or I may work hard to standardize my unstandard data. But right now, it's just kind of people are doing it in their own way. And, it's their prerogative. But we believe that the benefits would actually be much greater. I see Rebecca's going to say something.
Yeah. I mean, this is brilliant because it actually strikes at the heart of the problem. So actually, we have things in trade which we all need. We all need a bill of lading document, for example. The data on the bill of lading document is the data that we need that we can then run security checks. We can then run anti-money laundering, know your client, sustainability checks against each of the buyer and the seller on that bill of lading document. We know how far a piece of equipment or a good or a service is flowing. So that bill of lading document or a contract or an invoice, bill of materials, they are pieces of information that are generic. They are the same no matter where you are because those are the rules of international trade. So in trade and trade finance, we're actually quite lucky in that the information is transferable. The problem is getting that into a set of rules that allows that information to be interpreted. And it's those rules that we don't have at the moment. And obviously in the current climate, as Pamela said, the circumstances are changing. The politicization of everything at the moment is changing. It's becoming more difficult to create those rules. But actually, it will hold back trade if we don't start to think about not necessarily the standards, but actually underlying data. Because if we think about the underlying data, then actually that's where the rules sit. That's where the commonalities sit. That's what can be shared. That's not actually a controversial thing to be saying. So we need to build out from what we know we all need to know, as Pamela said, and take it into an environment where the technologies around all of that and how it's interpreted can be different because that's competitive advantage. That's a competitive market. It's where the fintechs come in. But the underlying all of that, you have information that you have to have in order to operate in a globally regulated environment. And that's what we're looking at.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. What about Sunay, if I ask you, what about the unstructured data? Because there was mentioned that there will still be a piece of unstructured data, since standards are limited by all parties need to align and agree on such structure. How do we deal with that in the meantime or in the foreseeable future, or what timeline are we talking to, and how is this addressed?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, Patrick. While we wait for standards to emerge, get adopted, and everybody agrees to kind of comply with that, I think we will still have to deal with, I would say, a minority, but certainly a set of documents or a set of data which are going to be unstructured for the foreseeable future, right? Like for example, I think there are about 9 documents which, like the cargo issuance document or the warehouse receipts, etc., which are still, I would say, not defined from a standards point of view, and there are reasons for that. So rather than trying to kind of force fit a standard where there are by nature, nuances which each party or each country or domicile kind of brings to it, I think today what I believe is there is enough, I would say, from a technology perspective, answers out there. If you had asked me this question 5 years ago, probably it was much more difficult to read unstructured data, right? By nature, unstructured data, I mean, we humans, we are kind of good at reading unstructured data and making meaning out of it. But today, I think machines are beating us in terms of digesting, let's say, a 3,000-page document and summarizing it into a few paragraphs, or be it once they know that information, you could just specifically ask for the pieces of information which you are interested in. So again, going with the 80-20 mindset, right? We are going to have to deal with some of these documents for some time, which are going to be in an unstructured format. So I think there probably we should look at some of these new age technologies. It could be AI or generative AI, which today are very powerful in kind of dealing with unstructured data, and then have probably a layer on top of it where a human can kind of come in, and then, or it could be again an automated way in which we are able to kind of achieve the digitalization end to end. So I think there are answers in technology, but we will have to find the right fit, what fits the right set of combination of structured and unstructured data, and probably stitch them together to get a harmonious solution, Patrick. That's what I would say on how to deal with unstructured data.
Thank you. Pamela, do you agree on that we should, we need to see this as an 80-20 rule, and then work with unstructured data, because that's a challenge which we'll consider?
So I would like to say that the technology is here using AI or other technologies to basically reverse engineer into standardized data format. I know that like data scraping and OCR and so on, they are being deployed. I actually think that a lot more work needs to be done on that, and I wouldn't actually put it into a large-scale supply chain in its current format. We're just beginning to do the experiments on that, from multi-party data into standardized data. So actually, I think the technologies which we should be looking at are those which have actually been deployed for 5, 10, 15 years, like sensors, like IoT, even like blockchain for certain transactions, because those are tried and tested, and because just now they're becoming cheap enough that they can actually be deployed at scale. And I think that cheap enough, the cost of deploying technology is a really key factor, because we don't want technology's evolution to accentuate disparities in the supply chain. So, and the thing is, if we start to deploy all of these new cutting edge stuff, what will happen is that we've got a set of supply chains which are operating at the frontier, probably run by very wealthy companies and very large companies. And then you've got the rest of the world, like other 90%. And that's not good either. The point of digitalization of trade is also to drive inclusivity. So I think we should deploy the technologies which are trusted, tried, and by the way, we didn't even get into the question of whether humans will allow AI to make the decision for them. Right? Most of the discussion you hear is like, okay, well, we'll let AI figure out some things and then let's send the human in to make the final decision. And that's also has to be dealt with. So I would rather deploy technology which is tried and tested, because that will generate more confidence in the human to just let the computer do what the computer is good at. and we focus on other stuff.
Let the confusion. That was a good one. We have a question here coming up in relation to data sharing. There's big differences between data sharing in the West compared to the South. What do you think the reason is that we can take a different stance and view and on data sharing? I think Rebecca.
Okay, so this is a hugely political question, and I'm going to have to be very careful how I answer it. So data sharing has become restricted to some extent by GDPR, the privacy requirements, data flow requirements, and PDS2 in Europe. So we do have data transfer issues across border. So it's not that we want to obstruct different types of data transfer. It's just that we want to be able to protect, or organizations want to be able to protect, the privacy of their clients and behaviors, because that is intrinsic. Now, against that backdrop is another very real thing that's coming along, which is that we need to start sharing data, because it's going to smooth trade finance processes. It's going to make decisioning easier. It's going to make money move across borders more simply, etc., etc. But underneath all of that is also a very real security element to all of this. So we need to understand where the risks are, and in order to understand where the global risks are, we also need to be able to share data. So, we need to know if a ship is moving from A to B using a vessel, for example, that isn't particularly energy efficient, that's maybe very old, that's burning up a lot of carbon, for example. We need to be able to know that, so that we can clean up some of those areas of trade and trade finance and commodity finance as well. So I think the problem that we have at the moment is that we've kind of got almost this paradoxical situation where we've got, on one hand, a lot of data that has the potential to be shared, and that should be shared in the interest of making things more streamlined and making things better, but also a very real concern to preserve people's individual freedoms and privacies. So I think that is actually the paradoxical situation we're in. And we've gone beyond a lot of this. Well, I really don't, there was a novel written a good few years ago called The Circle. We've gone beyond the circle where we don't mind having absolutely every single thing out there on Google, and Google knows everything about us. We've gone beyond that, and actually we're beginning to think there's kind of a bit of a backlash around all of that, but that's very much on the consumer side. And I think in the end, the issue and the differences and the interoperability will be solved once we've decided what data we need to make international rules work more simply and easier, and to create welfare benefits and so on and so forth. And what we can actually say is definitely private data, because in the end, the political concern that we have around all of this isn't so much about the transfer of data, it's about who owns the data underneath. Is it the individual, or is it the organization that has the data, or is it a political environment? So in a nutshell, I think that's where the challenges are. What's the solution? I think to start thinking about going right the way back down to basics. And I love doing this because I'm an economist and I like starting right the way at first principles. But if you start at first principles, what do we need to know in a transaction? What do we need to know in a cross-border payment? What do we need to know in order to make our world more secure? And actually, those will be the same no matter what country you're living in and what you're doing. So I think we actually need to think about the whats and the whys of why we're doing all of this. And I think if we understand what we're doing it for and why we're doing it, then that helps us understand what data needs to be shared.
Sunay, if I ask you to elaborate on, how do you strike the balance, and how do you navigate in this area?
I think this is a topic which can be debated for days together, Patrick, because like Rebecca pointed out, right? I mean, it's who owns the data, what control they are given to manage their data. So, for example, if a customer is assumed to own the data, right? Are there enough controls and consent options given to the customer to be shared within the borders, cross borders? Then there is regulation which comes in. Then there is the whole idea of my residents and my data should be within my borders kind of thing. So data residency comes in, data ownership comes in, and with all this, I think we have to still work together and identify that set of data elements which in the larger benefit of the entire ecosystem. What are those data elements that are probably easily shareable? What are those elements which should be shared with consent or with within the regulatory framework, of course. So I think we need to kind of break this down and try to identify that common set of data elements which will benefit everybody, and like Rebecca said, work through with probably a lot of, I would say, parlaying and lobbying and making sure that people understand the benefits, and at the same time, if there are people out there who want their data to be not shared, give them enough options and provisions to make sure that that set of data is not shared and they go in a different route. So I think it's a very complex world out there, Patrick, and we'll have to navigate through one by one. Once, I think, when there are proof points and once people are able to see the benefits in a few of these instances, I'm sure there will be a change of, I would say, or a little more, I would say it'll be easier to convince the rest of the parties in the chain or maybe regulators to make sure that, look, these are the benefits and this is how the whole framework of data management is going to work, both from a data residency point of view, data ownership point of view, as well as data privacy point of view. So I think, yeah, it's a tough journey, but I think it has to be done, Patrick.
Thank you. Pamela, question from the audience here. Do organizations like ICC, IMF, World Banks, and have a role to play here to increase the share of data from certain countries or part of the world? How do you see your role in this one?
So I think this is such a contentious issue, and we won't get agreement if we just talk about principle. The G7 tried that. The G7 came to agreement, but then when it went to the G20, it was more difficult. So if the G20 can't even agree in those leaders, then how is the rest of the world going to agree? So I would rather actually see more demonstrations of the benefits of data sharing. And we already see that nationally. So for example, within each economy, so in Hong Kong, where I am today, there's the commercial data interchange, which allows SMEs to share their data, which is aggregated in a government-run platform, which is connected to securely to a number like 50 or 60 data sources, including government data sources, private sector data sources, and the banks actually can tap into that with permission, and the SMEs can actually have their loans approved with a lot less paperwork. It's not documentary and so on. So it's secure data. Experiments like that, if we can take them across border, that will actually prove that you don't lose your shirt by sharing data or allowing your data to be shared. And it actually demonstrates the benefit. I think so. So I think the challenge is, how do we scale experiments like that? I know there's a couple of fintechs which are helping national governments to detect fraud in financial transactions. Those are all very successful. They're demonstrated. Now let's figure out, how do we take those global? And I know the BIS Innovation Hub is doing work on that as well. We need to prove that it's worth the effort, because we haven't succeeded on the theoretical argument. There's too many reasons to say no on theory, right? Because you don't know, it's risky, national security, da 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 da. So we have to just go get practical and demonstrate what we actually want to do and get approval and buy-in for that.
Could I maybe jump in, because there's a question here that is asking for clarification around data sharing, but that ties into what Pamela has just said. So the question is, can I challenge what I've said about not mattering what country, that the data we want to know will always be the same? So the question is that surely not the case, because there are national security conversations around it? So the point I'm trying to make is that there are core things in trade that everyone needs to know. We need to know the buyer, the seller. We need to know the issuing bank. We need to know the correspondent bank. We need to know an insurer. We have documents that we need to know within trade that contain data that is standard. And when we start talking about unstructured data, the world becomes very complicated, because that's where we start talking about anti-money laundering and know your client, and then we start having different standards. But actually, in terms of structured, standardized data, when you're looking objectively about what's involved in a trade finance solution, you're actually looking at very similar, if not identical, data parameters. So on top of that, you then get the layer of politicization. Now, if we're looking at data in terms of the way Pamela is saying and data is saying about data sharing, actually Pamela's talking about the types of data that will enable lending, will enable those transactions to happen. We're not talking about the type of data where there may well be national security issues associated with this. And in fact, by understanding what's happening at that transactions level, some of those national security considerations can be covered off anyway. So there will be restrictions around data, but what we have to be is very, very, very wary of the fact that we don't want to create two data systems. We don't want to create a situation like we had in the Cold War, where you've got one system and another system operating alongside each other. You want to have something where data, because global finance is still global finance, and the parameters of data that we need within global finance are still the same. They are objectively the same. The political aspects around this are very important as well, and increasingly important, as I said at the beginning. But what we therefore need to do is actually bring governments and financial organizations together to start talking about how they can work together to cover off some of these data points. So I think that's actually trying to square a diplomatic circle between the question and what Pamela was saying.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, please.
Can I just add to that? Building on what Rebecca said, I think a data hierarchy is really important, because not all data is created equal. If we can agree on the core data that needs to be shared across the supply chain, then that is actually a very much smaller subset than all the data in the supply chain. And so I think we need to really look at the core data, which is in compliance data, which is shareable data, and which is the data that drives inclusivity and creates norms. And then we need to speak specifically, rather than on this gigantic principle like data sharing, because on a gigantic basis, then nothing would be shared. So I really think we just need to get practical and start demonstrating the benefits to get people on board.
Good, and that's give us good segue to the things you said in relation to how we have the data in the trade documents, which we need in order to digitalize the trade chain and extract data, which we need downstream for in various services and topics, and bringing that to electronic trade document, which is a source of consuming or harness data from. There is a question from the audience in relation to essential legal reforms which are needed in order to harness that data from electronic trade documents. I think one of them is, of course, model law for electronic transferable record, saying that reforms are taking too long to emerge. What steps should be taken to hasten the legal reform process? What do you think we can do there to increase the pace on legal reforms? Pamela, I know that this is close to your heart.
Isn't that the magic question? So look, no one's against digitalization. It's all about capabilities, resources, and timing. And so our approach, when we go to get government commitment, and I don't necessarily think we actually need to wait for the bill to pass Parliament before the changes can be made. Actually, what we need is government commitment. So when we go to governments to seek their commitment to this journey, we have to speak the language that is their strategy and which is their growth imperative. How much will you grow trade? How many jobs will you create? And how will it drive inclusivity? Those are the goals of any government. It's the key to stability. So we need to give them this kind of evidence and then get the local business to join hands and advocate, because any government, yes, they listen to international organizations, but actually they really, really listen to their own business community, right? If it's a domestic issue as well as international issue, then that's the magic formula. So it's not quick. It takes a while to engage government, to build capacity, to get everyone on board, because it is a really broad change. It's multidisciplinary, multi-ministry. Takes around 2 or 3 years at least. So, but I think once governments feel confident to announce it, then business can actually begin to move. And by our calculation, we're at 37% of global GDP, which is already aligned. Okay, that's the US, Germany, UK, France, and around 6 other countries. And another 26% of global GDP, which has already committed publicly. This is Japan, China, Thailand, and a number of other countries. And the thing is that's more than half if you do the math. And so I have except that, that 26% isn't going to materialize legally until like another 1 or 2 years, but we can already begin to act. I think we are getting some kind of a very collaborative spirit amongst the advocates of this. And I think that is great because governments want to deal with one message, not multiple messages. So like here, collaboration is really important between the private sector, international organizations, multilateral development banks, and also the big MNCs, which are running the majority of global trade.
If I could maybe come in as well, having done lots of the economic research behind all of this, and I've looked at Africa and I've looked at all the countries across Africa, I've looked at the Commonwealth, we've run studies on Turkey, Morocco, we were starting to look at Morocco as well. There are, and the G7. So, I mean, around the world, there's approximately 9 trillion of US dollars in global trade that could be unleashed. Now, if we all believe that trade is a way of creating jobs and economic growth, and actually a lot of other benefits as well around interdependencies and preventing war, which is the World Trade Organization's angle around all of this, then obviously increasing the amount of trade between nations by making it simpler, by streamlining it, is going to be a benefit. The critical thing, though, is when you take this down into individual countries and the way in which those individual countries might implement. So linking the enabling aspect of MLETR adoption means that there are frameworks for using documents of title to create faster working capital, etc., etc. And what that does is potentially, we've heard qualitatively through all the research that I've done, that it has the potential to increase productivity, but most importantly of all, 2 things in a trade context. The first is that it reduces the potential for fraud because you're collecting data, you're sharing data, and you know where an awful lot of these things are going, where there might be issues with the combination of structured and unstructured data. But the second thing, when you're looking at emerging markets, and particularly in Africa, but in certain countries of the Commonwealth, you have the costs of doing trade at the moment are higher than the revenues that come in from trade. So if you look at the ease of doing business survey quantitatively, and you look at the trade revenues that might be coming in from trade, there's a difference. It's too costly to do business. So what we then need to do, and this helps with legal reform, is rather than just think about the MLETR adoption as a legal reform process, actually also think about it as a trade policy instrument as well. So start to think about how it can be used to create single windows, fasten cross-border crossings, allow intermodality in freight and transport. All of these types of things actually really help to start building up a case study, particularly in emerging markets where the infrastructures for physical trade aren't there. And so that I think is the most important set of benefits. And I noticed there was a question on Africa there. The research that I've seen and I've done says Africa is incredibly important, but what's important is not necessarily the electronic transferable records, it's actually creating a digital system that enables digital trade.
Thank you, Rebecca. And can I pick up on, I like the numbers, Pamela, which you gave. We are already up on 37% of global GDP, and another 26 coming. So we are well above 50%, which is, I think, more than people are kind of perceiving right now. So it's and if we are that far, and also tie into what you said, Rebecca, and I'm going to send this to Sunay. How do we tangible leverage on the downstream benefits and synergies of data, which we can now use from the electronic trade documents? Can you elaborate on your thinking around really taking the opportunity here to leverage the data once we have it approved or acceptable and adopted? And
Sure, Patrik. I think since I'll come more from a technology perspective, and I've seen this work in various other areas. Like, for example, if I look at payments as an area and how the whole ISO 20022 kind of standards emerging across the globe, how it led to interoperability between the networks, right? And the richness of data which comes with it, not just the basic information of who's sending money to whom, but the entire chain and what's the purpose of the payment, etc., etc. I mean, if I look at that whole evolution of payments, I would take one example of that. Now we see that a lot of institutions, not just banks, but also corporates and institutions, are also getting benefits of the richness of the data, right? Downstream is what I mean. So while the transaction happens, and then there is a lot more of information that can be gathered, analyzed, and taken advantage of in the long run. So just to give you a couple of examples, anomaly detection is something which today a lot of institutions are actively looking at. This is an extension to the AML technologies that exist today, right? The basic AML is kind of, everybody has to kind of comply with it, and there are enough systems out there. But then going beyond that, there are a lot of, I would say, frauds which are happening within an organization. There are patterns which can be recognized downstream, which can be then flagged off and then help improve not just detecting certain other, spurious patterns, but also it could also be helping regulators come up with, okay, so now we have achieved, A, B, C in terms of efficiencies. What next? So a lot of these benefits can be achieved considering, the data which is coming. Again, whatever comes in structured fashion, great. Whatever comes unstructured, there are still ways in which that can be dealt with. But overall, I think the benefits of, I would say, the data being in a digital fashion and the downstream benefits are multifold. We are just about opening up in terms of what are the benefits and things like that. There is a long road ahead for the benefits to accrue and then build back into the systems, build back into the chains so that all the parties in the chains benefit from that. Again, just to give you an example which is more closer to home, 3 years ago when Indians used to file their income tax returns, it was what the I would say what the income tax authorities had in terms of data was very rudimentary. It was more around what taxes were deducted at source and things like that. And as an end user, as a tax-paying individual, I would get very basic, 3-page, 4-page document kind of thing. But today, since last year, the amount of data which has already been in the systems, and this is all collected from various sources, various transactions which one individual does, but it kind of gives me a whole financial history of the entire financial year, and including transactions which are above a certain limit, etc., etc. So I, as a tax-paying individual, are now much more aware of where my transactions are, where exactly is my taxes getting deducted and things like that, than let's say 2 years ago. Extending this, I think the benefits will be 100-fold or 1,000-fold if you look at a complex trade transaction and so many parties involved. I think everybody gets to benefit by appropriately leveraging the downstream data.
Thank you. And Rebecca, when you talk about there is a business case here on $9 trillion here, is that also how you made your calculation and looked at this, that the downstream effects?
Yes, there was a question on this which I've just answered, and it's because of the multiplier effect. So I mean, in economics we have this thing called you put an investment in at the bottom, or you change the law in some way to create an enabling factor, and it then creates a multiplier effect through other things as well, because it streamlines. It makes single windows easier. It makes the political case actually in places like Africa for implementation easier. You're using regulation and you're using the law actually to change things without needing to create a massive public sector investment in infrastructure. So I mean, one of the things that really clearly came out of the work that I did in Africa was the fact that by enabling transferable records to be digitized, you then manage to have finance to be linked up with, in theory, and this is obviously, as Sunay says, a lot of this is still theory, but you can link it up with other things as well. And so cross-border, single windows, all those sorts of things become easier. And what that means is that you then get multiplier effects because more people can begin to access trade. And certainly, and as soon as you've streamlined things and the costs start to come down, then there are more people who can actually legitimately start to think about this. And this is in terms of the number of days that you have sitting at a border, for example, waiting for all the transactions and everything to go through before you can take your stuff over a border. We're looking in some parts of the world at a very different type of environment to using trade finance as an investable asset class. This is actually the lifeblood of some economies now. How does a woman with soft commodities going across a border in a rural emerging economy take that, who also has difficulties with reading all of that documentation? How do they do it? How do they take something across the border when they've got to wait for 10 days, by which time the produce has actually gone off? And these were some real examples that we saw in Africa of things that are happening, and it's excluding vast numbers of people. So to Pam's point, right the way at the beginning, we're looking at mechanisms for making trade accessible to a lot of these people in emerging markets who they're light years away from this sort of bigger framework of trade and trade finance and investable asset classes. They just want to be able to engage in the economy in the way in which they can, because that's what creates jobs and opportunities.
Thank you, Rebecca, and I want to pass that on to you, Pamela, because from your perspective and experience, working with multiple parts of the trade chain, is the dots connected? You know, we're talking about single window, and we in border control and custom authorities, and on the other side we're talking about, you know, financeable assets or asset classes in the financial industry. Have we connected the dots that, you know, we are all dependent on each other?
I think we're getting there. Everyone in theory wants to connect, and there's agreement that we need to align data. And there's even agreement on what the core data that we need to align is. So that's like the first hurdle. And I think there's also an understanding about needing some kind of common governance and interoperability platform, where you don't necessarily, where it's an open system, open, decentralized. And I think we have agreement about that across the whole vertical supply chain. Okay, now, have we solved which digital identity to use? No. Have we solved the question of, will single windows actually give out data that is tagged and traced and not just take it in? No. Do we have agreement from all the parties that everyone loves to share, meaning you give me your data? Okay, that's what sharing in the commercial context tends to mean. I think we have to get used to and practice the art of sharing, where I give you equally what you give me. And so I think that's the role of case studies. I think that's the role of pilots. And I think governments, in pursuing digital trade corridors, that is an essential part, because it basically allows people to practice the art of data sharing. So yeah, the science is falling into place. Now, can we change human habit, and can we master the art part, the EQ part? I mean, that's going to take practice, and it's going to take encouragement and tax and incentives. I mean, it's because it's a change in fundamentally, it's a change in the way we operate. And I think that aspect, that giant aspect that we're actually trying to solve for a lot of the problems that trade has created, right? Trade's great, jobs, growth, etc., but it's also very unequal. And so I think with this, we're not only trying to change the human habit and instill a belief that computers can do some things better than humans, like smart contracting and so on, but I think we're also trying to correct a lot of the so-called failings of globalization. And if we have to go slower in order to do so, I think that's a sacrifice that we should be willing to consider. Not so slow, but slower than, slow down in order to do it right.
Leave no one behind. Great, thanks, Pamela. And we only have a couple of minutes left, and I think this has been a really, really, really good discussion. I want to bring it down a little bit on a topic which close to my heart here, and got your reflection on. And I may start with you again, Pamela, because now we talked a lot about data, but still, if we go back to human beings, we still live in a world which use some kind of documents, and the documents gives data a context. That's one of the things, and it's also evidence agreements. Do you think that we completely can replace documents with data exchange, or do they have to coexist?
So the transition is coexistence. And so I think we're going to be stuck in a world that is dealing with digital versions of documents for some time. But eventually, the reason that we're focusing so much on core data, the core data that's embedded in the documents, is so that we can eventually shed the document. And so, yeah, we need to make sure the transition is actually smooth. So yeah, let's protect, let's protect people whose entire businesses and systems is built around data, and give them a way to transition out of, whose world is built on documents and give them a way to transition out of the documents. It's the transition from like trade facilitation to paperless trade and now to digital trade. You have to allow this journey so that people can feel that they're not totally in the unknown, okay? Because humans don't do well in the unknown. So yeah, we need to focus on the data elements, but today those data elements are in documents, so here we are.
Thank you. Sunay, if I ask you, will we transition and or will that transition mean that the document will just change character or form, or will it be, or it even possible to fully transform into just data in change?
So I think, yeah, definitely. I think a complete digitalization is everybody's dream, the holy grail of trade, etc. But I think the journey is going to be longer than what one would anticipate or one would hope for, Patrik. So, like Pam said, I mean, I couldn't agree more with her. I think it's taking the whole set of people who are involved. Ultimately, behind every trade transaction, you have to also look at the human element, the regulatory element, and the political, shifts which keep happening from time to time. So, considering all this, I think the journey is going to be longer than what one would wish for. But I think the direction is right, and we will get there eventually.
Thank you very much. Is it anything before? I think we're running to the end of the session. Is it anything, Rebecca, Sunay, Pam, you want to bring up?
One last thing. So I agree with Sunay and Pamela on the data itself, which is interoperable, and the process of transition. But I want to say one thing, which is that it is not trade that is globalization. Globalization is not trade. Trade is the movement of goods and services across border, right? That's what we're talking about. Globalization is something that has been constructed and has become weaponized and has become something that is more difficult. And it's around information flows, and it's around data flows, and it's around technology flows and the capital flows, etc., etc., etc. But at the end of the day, it's businesses that trade and not governments. And so if there is something that we can do to make this process of digitization actually show that it is possible to create international standards, and it is possible to work together as a global financial community, then surely that's a target worth setting for ourselves.
Thank you, Rebecca. And with that, I need to thank you, Rebecca, Sunay, Pamela, for a good discussion. And I also would like to thank our audience. And thanks for all good questions. We will capture them, which we didn't manage to capture in the discussion. I also would like to encourage you to follow Enigio on LinkedIn. We will of course post more on these important industry questions. And stay tuned. I hope we will come back pretty soon with more topics to discuss openly, transparently, and challenging. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.